like to welcome you all today to the first event being hosted by the Purdue Pipeline Center. The Pipeline Center is a new initiative here in the Department of Chemical Engineering that is devoted to helping women shape and reach their full potential. To do this, we're going to collaborate with academic, professional, and industrial partners to put on events that help women succeed in their field and make a difference. One of the areas of our events that we will be hosting will be in attempting to improve the environment and the work culture towards diversity in engineering. And we know that to do this, we will have to work with both men and women and increase education about gender issues in engineering. To do this, we are starting a speaker series on gender issues, and I am pleased to introduce our very first speaker in this series is Dr. Beth Holloway. Dr. Holloway is the director of the Women in Engineering program here at Purdue. She is also the assistant dean of the Undergraduate Education in College of Engineering. She does research in fields of retention of engineering students, engineering admission practices, and women in leadership. And I am happy to have you here today. And with that, let's welcome Dr. Holloway.
Thank you, Sydney. Can everyone hear me? I'm all mic'd up, but I want to make sure in the back you can all hear me. Yeah, good, great. This is sort of like one of those venues where everyone sits in the back and nobody wants to sit up front, but that's okay. I also want to thank particularly the School of Chemical Engineering for inviting me to come and do this with you all today. I am honored to be here. But we're going to talk about implicit bias, and this is something that sometimes can be difficult for people to talk about. Sometimes it touches some sensitive nerves, particularly as we think that we are all fair and meritorious people who have good judgment and we are unbiased. And unfortunately, what I'm going to tell you today is that we are all biased in lots of different ways. And we're going to focus today on how we're talking about bias in terms of gender, in terms of sex, males and females, men and women. But there's all sorts of kinds of biases, and we'll go through some of that. But first, we are going to have a little bit of audience participation. So, a question: are men and women more alike than different, or are they more different than alike? So how many people, and if you don't feel comfortable raising your hand, that's okay, but think to yourself, do you think that men and women are more different than alike? Okay, how many people would say we're more, didn't want to show you that third choice yet, more alike than different? Okay, quite a few. Now, how many people might change that to say that we're more alike than different, but the differences that we have can manifest with some pretty significant effects? Yeah, that's where I am actually. In the spirit of full disclosure, that's the one I pick. Okay. So let's talk about some of those differences. Many of the differences that we think we see between men and women are culturally based. And everything I'm going to talk about today is very US-centric. So I need to make that very clear, that what I'm talking about, all the research that I'm going to be talking about, is very US-centric. So it is not internationally based, although there are gender differences that we see in different cultures around the world. But many of the differences, not all, but many are based in our culture. And these culturally produced differences are reinforced and reproduced by what we call internal mental models, or schemas. You know, and schemas are things, they're basically shortcuts in processing. And they're sets of expectations of behaviors that we have that we think should be common to a particular group. So behaviors, traits, interests, etc. And we have schemas for lots of different things. We have schemas for gender, we have schemas for race, we might have schemas for age, for nationality, for all sorts of different kinds of things. One of the things that is most important for you all to remember as we talk about gender-based schemas is that studies have shown that men and women have the same schemas about men and women. Okay, so I am not standing up here in front of you to say that men are the problem and women are not. We are all in this together. We all have biases, and generally speaking, with regards to gender, they work in the same ways. Okay, so schemas, like I said, schemas can be thought of as brain processing shortcuts. They are automatic assumptions that we make based on our understanding of the world, based on our understandings of what we think is right, how it should work. In engineering terms, since most of us are engineers, or at least we work with engineers, when we're doing a problem solving, we usually start with, okay, there's the problem statement. What do we know? Given. What do we need to find out? What are we looking for in this problem? What assumptions can we make? And then how do we start the solution? You can think of these schemas coming in at that assume level. That's how they work. What isn't very clear is that schemas are almost instantaneous. So they're very fast. They're snap judgments. They're so fast we don't realize necessarily that we're making them. They're so ubiquitous that we don't realize that we've just made an assumption. Many times we treat those like givens, and they're not. So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit more. So, this picture, I want to ask you what you see. Do you see a young woman, or do you see an older lady? You can see both. How many people see the young woman? Okay, how many people see the older lady? How many see both? Yeah. So what's really interesting is, so for those of you who are not seeing the other, to look at this, if you look at the younger woman, what you see, I'm going to see if a mouse can help me point things out. If you're looking at the younger woman, this is a chin right here, her cheek. You can sort of see an outline of a nose, an eyelash. This is her ear, her hair, and she's probably wearing some sort of covering on her head. She's got maybe a necklace on right here, and this is a little feather that's coming out of her hat. If you are predominantly seeing the younger woman and you're like, there is no way there is an older lady in that picture, I will tell you that this is the nose here. This is the mouth. This is her chin. Here's an eye. Here's another eye. And this is her hair. Now, for the people who see it both ways, it's a little disconcerting because sometimes your focus changes in the middle of you're looking at it and you're like, this is a funky looking picture. But what I will say is that this is a picture, and some people might call it an optical illusion. But I want to point this out because our perceptions of what we see are shaped by previous knowledge and what we're conditioned to see. So even though we are all looking at the same thing, we might see something different. And that is, again, what I want you to keep in mind as we're talking about implicit or unconscious bias. We may be all looking at the same thing, but we might be seeing something different. Okay, here's an easier one for a lot of people. Do you see two people or do you see a vase? How many people see two people? How many people see a vase? How many people see both? Yeah, that's why I do this one second, because it's a little bit easier to see. The two people is what you see if you focus on the dark, the black, and the vase is what you see if you focus on the white. So it's a little easier to switch in between. But again, we're all looking at the same thing, and some of us can see the same thing from a couple different perspectives, right? So when we talk about, remember, the given, the find, the assume, the given may not be absolute fact. It may be our perceptions of what we're seeing. It may be an assumption. This is a little sensitive. Okay, so in terms of our schemas, and I talked about those in terms of this set of expectations that we have for behaviors, for characteristics, for traits. This is what traditional US society, the one that we live in, not 100 years ago, but the one we live in now, would expect more so of women and more so of men. Now, please know that I am not saying that all women are like the left-hand side and all men are like the right-hand side. What I'm saying is that these are a set of underlying expectations for behaviors, for interests, for traits that we have as a society. So we expect women to be a bit more nurturing, a bit more caring, a bit more communal, interested in people, very cooperative, supportive. And we expect men, I'm mic'd up in interesting ways back here. I think I'm just going to hold those. No, I'm good. Okay. So I'll just hold my little mess of mics as I'm talking. Okay, so we expect men to be a little more task-oriented, achievement-oriented, independent, not emotional, particularly at work, competitive, and interested in things. So when people act outside these expectations, they can be negatively judged, or at least not positively perceived. When we act within those, we are more or less positively perceived, or at least not negatively judged, because it's an expectation, even if we don't talk about it explicitly. Okay, so this is what I really also want you to think about. What are our expectations for engineers? And this is really specific to us in the STEM field. What do we expect of our engineers? And I got this very deliberately from a non-Purdue specific place, from monster.com. And I think it's about engineering school searches. It's engineeringschools.com. It's run by Monster. And it says, these are things that engineers are, these are qualities and traits of a good engineer. So, strong analytical aptitude, attention to detail, ability to think logically, mathematically inclined, strong problem-solving skills, a team player in pursuit of a goal, creative and good communication skills. So when I look at this list and I think of this list, I think, yeah, right? We want engineers to be those things. We want them to be strong problem solvers. That's what we do, right? We have to be mathematically inclined in some ways or we're not going to be an engineer. We have to be able to think rationally and logically, step through problems. Very much so. But then I think about, do these particular traits, when I put them up against which column are they more like? They're kind of more like the side in our expectations for men. So part of our issue within STEM particularly is that our expectations for women do not necessarily line up with our expectations for strong engineers, high quality engineers, the excellent engineers. So that is one of our issues. So let's talk a little bit about implicit bias. So some people will call it implicit bias. Some people might call it unconscious bias. Those two vocabulary words are pretty much interchangeable in this case. They're unconscious because we do not consciously think about them. We do not consciously know that they are working, that they are in existence. But what we do know about them is that they are pervasive and robust. So what I mean by that is that we can see somebody who belongs to a group that we wouldn't necessarily think of as majority in the group, and we can see them as an excellent member of, like we can see them, a female, as an excellent engineer, a great collaborator, an awesome researcher, a wonderful leader. But we do not necessarily think that the rule is wrong. We see them as an exception to the rule, not that the rule, that our underlying expectations don't hold up. We can see this in a quote, and I got this from actually probably somebody in chemical engineering. When I imagine an outstanding researcher, I see a man. But my closest research colleague is a woman, and I really respect her as a researcher. This is the exception to the rule. When I close my eyes and think about an outstanding researcher, I think of a man. But the person that I collaborate with most closely and who I respect most deeply is a female. And for whoever wrote that, I'm quite sure that they were aware that this was an implicit bias because it came out. How have you seen implicit bias work? But for a lot of people, they can hold this thought and not see anything wrong with that. Not see that maybe when they close their eyes, maybe they should be picturing a woman as an outstanding researcher. Okay, the other thing to note about implicit biases is they do not necessarily align with our declared beliefs. And I think as engineers and scientists, this particular one is the one that is probably hardest for us to think about. Because I can tell you as an engineer, as a scientist, I think I am logical. I think I am rational. I think I judge data based on the merits of the data. I think what I do is treat people fairly and equitably, that I'm not concerned about their gender or their race or their class or their nationality or the whatever, that I'm really just thinking about their results, their output, their performance. And I can say with all of my heart that I am not biased. But it turns out I have taken bias tests, and I am particular. And I will talk about, if you want to take a test, how you can do that, where they are. And that's at the end in the what can you do part. So biases do not necessarily align with our stated belief systems. They work so much under the surface that we do not realize that they are working at all. They do have real effects on our behaviors. Absolutely. There are boundaries to acceptable behaviors, like I talked about. And when people work outside of those boundaries, when they are a little different than what we expect them to be, we either judge them negatively or we don't think of them positively. Classic, well, I'll talk about that in a minute, our classic example, but that's coming up in a few slides. One of the things I want to make sure that we all are on the same page about is that men and women have these same biases. Absolutely. And I will show you some research studies that prove that. But men and women have these same biases. The good news is they're changeable, or at least they're manageable. We can manage our biases, but we have to know about them first. Okay, so here are some examples. So there was a survey that was sent out to grad students here in chemical engineering, and there were a few grad students who said I could use some of their examples. So these are some quotes I got, not exact quotes. I changed a few words here and there to maintain anonymity and all of that kind of stuff. But a male respondent said, in a room full of engineers, few of them will think that the smartest person in the room may be a woman. A female respondent said, when I see women I don't know in the building, my first thought is they are staff from another department or visiting mothers. Not that they might be faculty. At a social gathering, people assume that I am the spouse, not the engineering faculty, or not the reason that my spouse and I were invited. And some of these happen to all of us, whether people assume that I'm the spouse, not an engineering faculty member. That can happen to you. But when you see a woman that you don't know in the building and your first thought is, might be a visiting mom or it might be a staff person from another department, those are judgments that we make. Now, the folks that responded and gave me these examples, thank you very much, whoever you are, and it's great that you know that these are examples of implicit bias. And what I challenge you to do is to think about, do you all have similar kinds of experiences where you've sat in a room full of engineers, and I guess sometimes we sit around and think about who's the smartest one here? Who's the most accomplished one here?
Would you mind a question, or would you want to wait until?
No, sure, come on, let's go.
I'm just wondering if it's not possible to infer, based on those statements, that it is a reflection of the frequency with which you see people involved in specific things.
Okay, so
It doesn't have to necessarily mean implicit bias.
Yeah. Right. So the question for all of you who couldn't hear that, and for the recording, which is another mic that I have, is, are these kinds of statements perhaps a reflection of the frequency with which you encounter such situations, right? So the frequency with which you see someone you don't recognize, a woman you don't recognize in your building, and it actually is a staff member from another department or somebody who's visiting. Potentially, yes, and that is exactly how our mental models, how our schemas work. They're based on our understanding of the world. They're based on our frequencies. They are processing shortcuts that our brain makes so that we don't have to think about it any harder. Because if we really had to process each and every single piece of data that comes into our head and question, is it real, is it not real, I think maybe our head would explode. It wouldn't work. So yes, that is a great point. It is absolutely related to the frequency. But that doesn't mean, so what happens is not that the problem is that your initial thought is this. It's the what happens in the behaviors after your initial thought is this. Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about that. So let's talk about some performance reviews. Now this was done, this study was done in corporate setting. There was a linguist who collected a whole bunch of performance reviews from a variety of different companies, large organizations, and these are all technology companies, to small startups. And these performance reviews were done by both male and female managers. That's important to note. They were done by both male and female managers. Critical feedback, so feedback in terms of employee needs to make improvements in this area, employee needs to do this better, right? Critical feedback was found in just less than 60% of male employees' reviews and in 88% of the female employees' reviews. The feedback to the men was centered on the development of skills. So skill development so that they could progress, so that they could advance within the organization. Women's critical feedback also had skill development as a part of it, but also included interpersonal critiques, how they work with other people. And in fact, 71 of the 94 reviews that contained critical feedback, of the women's reviews that contained critical feedback, had critiques of their interpersonal behavior. It was much, much, much less prevalent for the men. In fact, for the men, some of the quotes were like, you know, he needs to work on his patience a little bit and working with other people, but we all have that issue. The one word that showed up over and over in women's reviews that did not show up a single time in the men's reviews was abrasive. She's abrasive. And all of its derivatives. Aggressive, difficult to work with, overly ambitious. Like there's a cap on how much ambition you can have. Overly ambitious. There are other impacts of our implicit bias. Like I just showed, it shows up in performance reviews. I'd be fascinated to see some of the annual reviews that faculty get, to see how that, some of the heads may want to look at that, do their own little study, see what words show up for one males versus females. But it shows up in teaching evaluations. So women's evaluations frequently include references to appearance, to friendliness, to smiliness, in both directions, by the way. Like she smiles too much, she doesn't smile enough. Like there's a balance in how much you can smile during class. Not enough, too much, I don't know. Men's almost never have any comments about their appearance or their personal demeanor. There are also impacts on hiring processes, resume, CV reviews. I can't even tell you how many studies I have read that talk about, this is fascinating to me, they take a group of reviewers, male and female reviewers, they give them a set of resumes and they ask them, which one is better? And the resumes are identical, like absolutely copy, paste. The only difference is one has a male name at the top, the other has a female name at the top. The reviewers, remember, both male and female reviewers, consistently ranked the men as being more qualified for the job, that they would be more likely to hire the male for the job, and they think that the male should start out at a higher salary. So one of the studies that I read was done within the last couple of years, and that salary differential was $13,000. And it was in an engineering and scientific, it was actually for a lab manager position. But they've done this study for resumes in the business world. They've done it not just based on gender, but they have done it also based on ethnicity. An African American sounding name versus a white sounding name. Same results, more or less. So even though we think that we are reviewing, that we are fair and balanced and equitable people, even though we are looking at the exact same data, we can still judge men to be more competent and women to be less. That is how implicit biases work, because I would guess that if you talk to any one of those reviewers afterwards and ask them point blank, do you think men are better suited to this position than women? They would say no. They might even say that we are actively trying to recruit more women. They might also say that the pool just isn't there. We don't see the quality that we see with the men's resumes or CVs. There was another study that was done that had potential graduate students, all fake, email faculty and ask some questions and ask if they would be willing to meet to have a discussion about research topics. When a male name was at the bottom of the email, they got a significantly higher response rate. It was the same email that was sent out. And they sent it to both male and female faculty, by the way. Evidence of bias also shows up in recommendation letters. So there have been studies of adjectives used to describe students and his or her characteristics. And it turns out that male students are described very much more by their technical capabilities, their technical potential, and their concrete contributions or achievements. Women's letters tend to focus more on how they get along with the rest of the lab, how they create consensus within the lab, and how they are supportive of their fellow lab mates, and much less so on their technical contributions and achievements. In promotion processes, that would be like tenure and promotion processes, so very much centered on campuses, there are folks who question the professional commitment of a woman who dares to become a parent before she has tenure. Because clearly, tenure is not so important to her if she decides that she wants to be a parent. But actually, men's parental status gives them a boost in promotions. If they are a parent, they actually, it's kind of like a little positive thing going on for them, a little plus column. It also can show up in introductions. Introducing a key speaker for maybe a weekly seminar, and you have lots and lots of men come along, and all of their introductions are focused on their technical accomplishments and their achievements and all the great things that they do. And then you have a female speaker come in, and the introduction talks about some of those things, but also mentions that she's a grandma, 2. Now, last time I checked, being a grandma had nothing to do with what I can do at work and my accomplishments and achievements. Or maybe it does. Maybe it says I have succeeded in spite of being a parent. But either way, does it really matter that I am a parent or a grandparent? No. So the impact of these kinds of behaviors and outcomes can manifest themselves at times in the confidence levels of our confidence levels, right, of us in this room. It can have the impact of boosting men's confidence, and in some ways, suppressing women's. And there's some really interesting research that was done that showed some kind of interesting connections between confidence and interest. So for men, if they are confident, for men, if they are interested in something, they are absolutely confident they're going to be good at it. No question. You can see this in kids all the time. If you ever go to a Little League baseball game and you watch the boys playing, it's like totally awesome how many of them think that they're going to be Major League Baseball players someday because they really like baseball. So therefore, they are going to be good at it. They're interested in it, so they are confident they're going to be good at it. For girls, it's the other way around. If they're confident that they'll be good at it, it's something they're interested in. Now, this is a manifestation of our society and how we raise our children, but this gets reinforced at every step of our professional and personal development. Pointing in the wrong direction. It also manifests itself in terms of who applies for what positions. So research has indicated that men will apply for a position if they meet about 60% of the required qualifications. And that women will apply if they think they meet them all, because it says a requirement. But again, if men are interested in something, they are confident they're going to be good at it, even if they haven't done it at all. So it can show up in who applies for what opportunities that we give our students. It can show up for how you might think about what jobs you're interested in. Oh, this is really touchy. So, if you do a simple example, and this comes from Virginia Valian's Why So Slow research, which was done quite a while ago, but this particular example doesn't have a time stamp on it. If you start with a group of 50% men and 50% women, and you have 8 promotional levels, and you give just a 1% advantage to men in each of those promotional levels. Now, 1% is like really small in terms of an advantage. After 8 promotions, that group is 65% male. Now, what I want you to do is think about a promotion as every performance assessment ever, like university admissions processes, like hiring processes, like performance reviews, and as every time someone is encouraged or not to take the next step in STEM in some way, by their teachers, by their parents, by their guidance counselors, by their friends, by their advisors, by their professors, by their mentors, along the entire spectrum starting from birth. there's likely a lot more than 8 steps in that process from birth until where we all are sitting now. And there's certainly more than 65% male representation in both the College of Engineering and chemical engineering, at least at the graduate and faculty level. The undergraduate level is close to that. So we can see how implicit biases, which don't give necessarily a huge advantage or disadvantage to anyone, that one-time little thoughts, comments, one resume review, one maybe focus in a performance review on interpersonal skills when you probably wouldn't have said that about a male, that one time that happens is probably not a big deal. But these implicit biases are so pervasive by all of us, and we all do it, that this happens over and over and over again. And that is why they are so important for us to be able to manage, because they are very small individually, but they accumulate significantly over time. I talked a little bit earlier about how women can sometimes get dinged for being overly ambitious. And there was a study that proves this. So in a company, again, not here in academia, but in industry, there was a study of men and women, and the study found that about equal numbers of them want to be promoted, 3/4 of each group. And then they looked at, for entry-level employees, how many of them wanted to reach the highest possible levels within their company. And, at the entry-level phase, the numbers of men and women, the percentages of men and women who wanted to reach the highest levels was about the same. Men's desires to get to the top intensify over time. That's what the study found as their career progresses. And women's ambition, for the most part, not about each individual woman, but in general, women's ambition gradually fades away. What was fascinating about this is that a lot of people will say it's that family thing. Women want to focus more on their family, and their work-life balance isn't really conducive to a high-intensity career. And so, once women decide that they want to be moms, then they aren't ambitious. They're not as ambitious anymore. And it turns out that this study found that there was absolutely no evidence that marital or parental status contributed to the drop-off in women's ambitions. And what is the driver? Women aren't rewarded for pushing to advance. They're actively penalized in critiques of their interpersonal skills, in critiques of that being called overly ambitious, like there's a cap on how much ambition women can have. And they subtly get the message. And many of them leave engineering altogether. Sometimes not to stay home, but they leave to go to another industry that might be more hospitable, that might fit in with the expectations, like women can do this job. There's a good match between our expectations for that kind of a professional and our expectations for women, or at least not as big of as a mismatch. Okay, so what can you do? So now I have completely depressed all of you. And I think I've told you that every person in this room is part of the problem. So what can we do to change this? First and foremost, you can become aware of your biases. One of the things that you can do is take the implicit association test. This is something that's been around for quite a long time, run out of Harvard. And they have implicit association tests for a lot of different things. One of them is gender and STEM, but there's a lot of different ones. I think the last time I was on there were maybe 25 or 30 different combinations of things that you could look at and see perhaps where your biases may be. Now, for a lot of people that I've talked to who have done this, and in my world I know a lot of people who have done this, most of the people who are willing to say what their results are say, oh my God, I got that I was biased against women in STEM. I am one. It happens. There are a few people that I have talked to who have said, I'm biased towards women in STEM. That's fascinating to me. I don't know why. And then they think about it and they go, oh yeah, so I had this role model and this mentor, and then there was my mom. A lot of times it comes back to my mom. But for the most part, the vast majority of people will find out that they are biased towards men and a bit against women in STEM. You can also look for training on how to mitigate implicit bias. Facebook and Microsoft have made theirs publicly available, what they do for their employees. You can look it up, see what they do. You might want to see if you can do some things that in your area, maybe you can host a little training session. Maybe it will inspire you to make some changes about some of your processes. In fact, that's the next point. Think about how bias can creep into these things. I've linked here to a Washington Post article which talks about the UK. So this is the one time it's not US-centric. But how the UK, there are companies in the UK, Deloitte is a big one, there's a few others, and some of the universities in the UK are deliberately leaving names off of applications completely, and they're being replaced with a code number. And once a decision is made on that person, whether they're either admitted to university or not, or they're going to be invited for an interview or not, then the name is replaced so that people can be in contact with them. But that initial review stage, the name, which can be a trigger for implicit bias to work, is removed. I would also challenge you to pause, to think critically between the given and the solution, right? To think about what are my assumptions and are they valid in this case? Am I judging this person positively or negatively in a way that if someone of the opposite sex did that very same thing, I would have a different reaction? I find this helpful for myself when I think about, when I think about my kids, and I get really frustrated with what one of them does. I think, okay, would I be this upset if it was my other child who did this? And I have a boy and a girl, so it goes both ways. This also can come into play during performance reviews. Would I write this same thing if this person was of the opposite sex? In a recommendation letter, you can think, would I write the same thing if this student were of the opposite sex? In fact, one of the things you can do for the faculty and any of the grad students who've written letters of recommendations for undergraduates, to look at them. Look at what you've written. As a whole, how have you described the men? How have you described the women? Are there patterns in what characteristics you chose to focus on? Are there words that show up in one set that don't show up in the other? And in fact, I was talking with one of our faculty members here who shall remain completely nameless in the College of Engineering, who said that he had first heard a talk about implicit bias, was absolutely convinced that he was fair and equitable, thought that the whole talk was, a little suspicious. And he said, I'm going to prove to myself that I am fair and equitable. I'm going to go back and look at my recommendation letters. And he did. And then he saw, oh my, I did exactly what the study said I did. I used words for women that I don't use for men. I focused on characteristics for women that I don't for men, and vice versa. So that was his moment of saying, okay, there's probably something to this, and I need to be conscious of it. So I need to check my assumptions. And that's what I'm trying to ask you all to do, is to check your assumptions. Okay, so one last thing about gender differences, and then we are going to have a discussion. So a lot of people that I talk to, they don't want to think about the fact that difference exists, right? They want to deny that there are differences between men and women. And they want to say, we are all just engineers. Doesn't matter. But denying that difference exists is a really strong mechanism to ensure that nothing changes, that everything that we have will continue to be like it is. Now, on the other hand, we have people who are really psyched about focusing on the differences. But focusing on difference pretty much exclusively is a really strong mechanism to ensure that the gender stereotypes and schemas that we have will continue indefinitely. The solution, if there is one, is balance. To focus on the differences that manifest in significant ways. Not to focus on all the differences, not to focus exclusively on the differences. This is kind of why I said at the beginning I'm in the camp of men and women are more alike than different, but the differences can manifest themselves in some pretty significant ways. This is why. You can't just focus on the fact that there are any or ignore that there are any. You have to do both. Okay, so what do y'all want to talk about? Okay.
So traditionally we have graduate students. Oh yes, let's.
Oh. Thanks. That's okay. You don't feel like you have to applaud for me. There could have been silence. I'd have never known that wasn't traditional.
So we traditionally allow graduate students to ask questions first, so we can start our discussion with questions from graduate students. I'll start off with a question.
Okay.
So you talked about how appearance and gender names can affect the way that you would respond to a person. Could you talk about how a gender-neutral name or a gender-neutral appearance might affect how these biases?
Yes. So the question is, I talked about how gendered names or appearances can perhaps affect how we talk about or how we think about a person, how we judge a person. And so Sydney's question is, how might a gender-neutral name or a gender-neutral appearance, how might that affect us? I actually haven't seen any research on that, but my experience would tell me that that bugs the heck out of us, right? A gender-neutral name, our first thought is it a man or a woman? Like, why it's important, I don't know, but that's where our head goes. Our processing is like, oh, I have to know that. Or if we see somebody on campus and you can't tell right away if it's a male or a female, our attention is drawn. Oh, wait, I didn't get a good look. I got to look closer. Again, it has no bearing on our life, anything to us, but that disruption in the processing makes us take a second look. So I think that goes with, in some ways, that fits with the idea of taking names off the resume, right? You ask yourself the question, is it a male or a female? And you know what? You're not going to figure it out because the name isn't there, unless there are some cues within the resume itself. But it makes you look at the substance of what's there and not the surface. Good question.
So when you look at somewhere, for at least what I've seen from research wise, when you look at somewhere like Europe, where there are a lot more female heads of states, there are a lot more females in higher positions. What do you think is the biggest cultural difference between those? That where can we move to? Obviously it's not perfect, but work towards what they're doing.
Right. So the question is, when we look at other parts of the world where there are women in significant leadership positions, heads of state, etc., higher leadership positions, why do I think that is, and what might we be able to do to move more in that direction? Did I get the gist of your question? That's a great question. And I think that there are some cultures where women's leadership, women's accomplishments are more promoted. For example, in our own, not quite backyard, but really close, in Puerto Rico, a significant percentage of students, engineering students, are women. It's close to 50%. There are parts of South America where that's true. There's parts of Eastern Europe where that's true. There are also other parts of the world where it's worse than here. And heads of state, there actually have been some really interesting studies about women being heads of state of countries which are not necessarily promoting of women's leadership and equality. I'm not an expert in that area in comparing cultures. In fact, there's a new research study that is started by some faculty in engineering education, which is going to look at what are some of the cultural drivers that have countries end up with higher percentages of women in engineering than others. It's going to be a fascinating study. But I would say likely that we're kind of doing that exception to the rule thing in countries. I think of, for example, in the UK, Margaret Thatcher. In India, there have been, I think, more than one head of state that has been female. And just one? Just one, thank you. But it might be more of an exception to the rule than this is the actual cultural expectation.
There was one in Sri Lanka.
There's one in Sri Lanka? Yeah.
Any other students? Yeah.
Thank you so much for the talk, Dr. Holloway. I really appreciate it. I'm just curious, you talked a lot about the difference between men and women in engineering. Do you have any data or read any papers on the topic of particularly women of color in engineering? How the differences are different than maybe women who aren't part of that group?
Yes, that's a great question. So the question is about, I talked about differences between men and women, but I kind of skipped the whole women of color, men of color, race and ethnicity broadly part. And is there any data about those groups particularly? I will say yes, there is some data. I skipped it sort of purposefully, sort of not, because for women of color particularly, there's lots of things going on, right? So first, there are biases that happen as a result of their gender, their sex, being female, in a male-dominated profession, in a male-dominated school. There's also stuff that happens in terms of implicit biases with regards to underrepresented groups, broadly. So people of color, people from that they're underrepresented in terms of their nationalities here, sexual orientation, in fact, the whole LGBTQ community, sometimes religion. There's lots of biases going on. And what the studies tend to indicate is that for people who have that belong to multiple underrepresented groups, that the accumulation of biases is greater, right? So I can stand here as I describe myself in some cases like these. I am a white woman. I am Christian. I am heterosexual. And those things, apart from that woman thing, all the rest of it, I'm pretty much in the majority, right? So my experiences with implicit bias are going to be very different than somebody who is in an underrepresented group in all of those categories, for example. Yeah, that didn't exactly answer your question, but it gets to the complexities of adding. You can't really add them up. It's not an additive factor, but it goes towards the concept of what theorists would call intersectionality, right? You're not, how do you say this? You can't say, you know, in this situation, I'm white. In this situation, I'm a woman. In this situation, I'm this, right? You're always all of those things. So it isn't really just a one add, but it certainly isn't the same kind of experience if you're underrepresented in one way and majority in lots of other ways. Okay.
Do we have any undergraduate student questions? I have one before we go to the faculty. If we notice that we're the recipient of implicit bias from a superior, what would you recommend for strategies to address that without threatening your relationship with your superior?
That is probably the hardest question I'm going to get. Okay, so for all of you that may not have heard that, if you feel that you are the recipient in some way of implicit bias from your superior, what are some ways you might deal with that so as not to threaten the relationship with your superior? So my first reaction is, ooh, tread lightly. You know, one of the things that I would probably first think about and advise is to think about, is it bias? And it's this is one of the ways that implicit bias is pervasive and robust, is because it's super hard to say, that's implicit bias, to somebody who has no clue that they have implicit biases. So, and sometimes it's very, there's a dent in the floor up here. Sometimes it's very hard to point out or to think about, is it implicit bias or is it something else? I mean, am I overly abrasive or is it implicit bias? Because let me tell you, there are certainly people, both men and women, who are overly abrasive, right? So if that shows up in your performance review and you happen to be a woman, you can't say implicit bias, right? Maybe you really are. Maybe you need to work on that. So you have to think about, is it real? And sometimes the only way you might know that is if you talk about it with someone else. Like, okay, seriously, be honest with me. Am I overly abrasive? Do I need to work on that? And then you have to filter that through, is that person implicitly biased about the same thing? Right? So it's a complex thing. But if you become reasonably certain that that's what it is, I think you probably need, did you raise your hand?
I was going to propose that we offer this regularly and we invite everyone regularly, and hopefully that's part of the solution, that we work on both aspects of the
That would be an organizational solution, yes, to hold these kinds of things more frequently so more and more people become aware that these things exist and that maybe they'll think about, is it me and what am I doing with my coworkers, colleagues, students, peers, etc.
I have an idea.
Greg has an idea.
Might be a bad one.
You never know.
But let's say your supervisor said, let's use the abrasive one, right? And said, you're kind of abrasive. Or whatever, you know, that's the point that he or she is trying to get across to you. And let's say that, for instance, he makes reference or she makes reference to how you are in a meeting. Then maybe what I would do is say, if I was the graduate student in that position, I would say, well, I think, you know, maybe I speak up a lot in meetings, but so does my colleague so on and so forth, right? Do you consider them to be abrasive? And kind of put it back on them without really saying, hey, you're wrong, but you know, I see in my style something that reminds me of Joe. Do you consider Joe to be abrasive? And if their face just kind of goes, you know, you got them.
It's not about getting people, well, Professor Shaver.
I know, you know what I'm saying? Maybe a light bulb would go on, and it wouldn't be a bad one. I don't know.
Yeah.
You're the expert, I'm not. But something like that, you know, I don't like the idea of letting it go, right? Because it's not going to go away.
That is true.
So
if you don't say anything, right, we talked about that. If you don't say anything, if you don't try to change anything, if you don't do anything, it's all status quo. Nothing changes. Bev?
I'll make an attempt at an answer.
Thank you.
My personal experience, and I'm thinking of me going offshore, you know, working with blue-collar workers there, me going to Qatar, interfacing with Middle Eastern men, and I would say we were both full of implicit bias. And it's not till you build the relationship and you get to know people as individuals, back to the frequency comment, that it overcomes the bias into what the people really are.
Also a good suggestion that relationship building can help mitigate some of these biases, because unfortunately though, then you become the exception to the rule, not a changing of the rule, but it might make the situation itself better.
Yeah, so like if that happens enough, right?
Perhaps, if it happens enough over time.
Would it change the list, the assumptions on your very first slide? That's one of the things I want to ask.
Yeah.
Like, we associate this with men and this with women. If there was more and more and more of that, which is going to take a long time, would our assumptions about what men should be and what women should be, can that change? I know we have to, that's not going to change quickly.
Right.
So implicit bias is here for a long time. But are there some things that we can like fundamentally do to start to change that list?
And you know, in actuality, I think that list is starting to change for women. Right? So for girls are given a little more latitude to do a little bit non-traditional things, right? They're maybe not judged as harshly. They might not be perceived positively as much, but the harsh judgment has lessened over the past probably 30, 40 years. Unfortunately, for men, it isn't changing very much at all. So I think in many ways, I'm a little off topic here, but in many ways I think it's harder to grow up as a boy than it is as a girl. Girls are now given a little bit more latitude with what they want to play with and what they want to do. There's a public outcry about degenderizing toys and buying girls building sets and getting them interested in STEM, and don't call them bossy, call them, they have leadership potential. And that's awesome, right? But where is the similar discussion about what we expect from our boys? And it doesn't, I don't see it. So yes, I think they can change over time. Again, it isn't just you and me making that change. It's, you know, all of us, and not just all of us here, but all of us in society. It's slow, but it does change. Yeah, they can change.
I think we have time for one last question.
I think it's going to take a while.
A simple question. Or I guess the other elephant in the room is if you look at the major engineering disciplines, clearly certain departments and schools like and disciplines like chemical engineering and biomedical engineering are approaching 50-50 mix in the students, whereas mechanical, electrical, and so on are still very skewed. And so going forward, and especially in your role in engineering for the whole college, do you see a bifurcation of the main challenges and goals and objectives for the schools that are approaching gender equality in numbers versus the schools that are still very skewed?
That's a great question. Yeah, okay, I'm getting the sign. I need to repeat that. So in engineering, there are certainly some disciplines that are closer to gender parity than others. So are there differences in what we might do in those different contexts because of that, I think is the short version of your question. I think that there are some issues that are similar across all, and some things that are different. So mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, aeronautical engineering, they tend to be on the lower end of representation of women. There's lots of reasons for that. Some are historical, based in their history. Some are how they talk about themselves. Some are general perceptions that the public has of, and kids have, of what they do. And so that is an issue that does affect them more so than chemical engineering or biological engineering or biomedical engineering, which are closer to parity. But I would suspect, even if you look at the, let's say chemical engineering, for example, because we're here, and most of us, you all, not me, are chemical engineers. Chemical engineering has been 30% or more women in the undergraduate level for a super long time, at least 20 years. And yet, at the faculty level, there should be a pretty strong group of women who have graduated with undergraduate degrees in chemical engineering who could have gone on to graduate school, who could have been hired in faculty. The numbers drop off very significantly. And what that tells me is that there's still things like implicit bias very much in play, that we might have gotten over some of the perceptions of what chemical engineering is and who could be interested in it and who could be successful, but we haven't gotten past the who is going to be really become a leader in those areas. And that is an issue that is pervasive across engineering. So some schools have that plus others, and some just primarily have that.